Welcome to Best Practices with your Quilt Magician. And we've already got a few questions coming in today about if you have a different product like the Shirley Stitcher, the Shirley Stitcher 2, uh, will this pertain to what you have? And some of it will. So I'm excited to let you know that some of the information is the same for different robotic systems that Tin Lizzie has put out through the years. What we're going to talk about are the best practices, the best way to maybe set a design. So Donna has already asked, do you have to set up a quilt area and the pattern box when you're doing an edge-to-edge design? And we're going to talk about that, so I'm really excited. And Donna has the Shirley Stitcher too. So there are a lot of things that we're going to cover this morning in our 1 hour period of time. So let's get started. This webinar is hosted by Tin Lizzie, and I'm Denise Applegate-Schober, and I'm here to introduce you to some of the best practices with your Quilt Magician. Now, a couple things about the Quilt Magician. It reads 3 file formats. It reads the QCC, the QLI, or the DXF. And these are vector files. It's a specific type of file, a specific way that it's made. And it's a line drawing. It's not stitches. So when we think about what the design is, it's a line drawing. If our machine is having stitching issues, that has to do with the machine itself. The Quilt Magician, it really just moves the machine, and the machine does the work. It reads a USB stick and an SD card. Now, I'm looking at this picture here, and that's a picture of the side left-hand view of your Quilt Magician. So you have a power port, a USB stick, and an SD card. And the label on the SD card goes towards the back. And when you eject the SD card, you want to do a safe eject. And we'll talk about how to do a safe eject on your computer. And a safe eject in your Quilt Magician is going to be a push in and let it pop out. And I personally do this with it off because that way I know it's not reading something, it's not engaged with the SD card or the USB stick. You also want to use your stylus. And the stylus is really important because it actually selects specifically what you're touching. You know, when we use our finger, it might select 500 diodes on the computer screen, where the stylus selects specifically what you want to touch. So just a little tip, the stylus for your unit. Now, setting up for quilting. When we're setting up for quilting, once you have your card inserted, the entire robotic system is ready and ready to go. Now you have a box, a black box underneath your machine on the carriage that has a power button on it also. I know that there are a few new people to their robotic system, so there are really 2 power buttons. There's a power button on the machine, and there's a power button on the robotic system, and that's going to turn on separately from your machine. If you're setting up new, you'll want to read your user's manual because it talks about getting started and the first thing you need to do. And that's found on page 5 in your user's manual about the first thing you want to do and how you want to set it up. So be sure that you go and set that up because the factory settings and how you set up your Quilt Magician are very important to get them synced together. So this is the main screen of our Quilt Magician. And on that main screen, we've got a lot of icons. So I'm going to go over each of these icons and talk about, you know, what that icon does and the function of that icon. We're going to talk about the space. So laying out the space of your quilt, laying out your working area, laying out your quilt block. So that might be the quilt space. So we'll talk about how to set that. Remember, just after you set up your quilting area, you have a box now that you can quilt in. You can adjust that, okay? So don't be afraid to adjust that as you set your points or as you do things, but keep in mind that box is a specific area to keep you from hitting your take-up rail. That's the rail on the inside of the machine, and keep you from hitting your backing or your top rail in the front. So let's get to know your icons and how to use them. So we're going to go straight across the top, and we're going to start with the first one, which is our home. And the home button, think of this as your button to get to everything in your robotic system. Meaning, if I was going in my computer and I was going to open up a file, okay, I'd go to the My Documents, and then I'd go to the File folder, and then I'd go to where I'm going. That's kind of what your home is. It's kind of like your My Documents of your robot, your where to go. All the master functions, all the master files are found in your home. The second icon is the tablet button. And this button is for saving, for nesting features, for moving features. So it has some great features to it if you've never used that. The first few months I had my Quilt Magician, I didn't use it, and then I was like, whoa, I'm missing a few things that I could be using there. The next one is the magnifying glass. This icon allows you to zoom in and out of your pattern, and that's really nice when you want to see if you've got them lined up or if you have them touching so that you're connecting them together. So the magnifying glass becomes an important element for seeing better, especially as we get older. Our eyes are not getting any better. So Teddy wants to know how to get back to the home position after she's messed up. And I'm not sure what that means, Teddy, and what you mean to get back to it. So I'll have to look into that further on what that is, or give me just a little more information if you could. The next icon is our sewing machine, and this will bring you back to your sewing machine menu. So if you're in the robotic menu and you need to get back to your sewing machine, maybe you forgot to turn your lights on the sewing machine. You can get there by touching the sewing machine icon button. Then you have two buttons here that are grayed out. These stay grayed out until you're working in the robotics mode. And also, if you're working on horizontal or vertical, okay, you have horizontal and vertical locks that you have. So we'll talk about those. Those are over here. So all of these icons right here really gray out until your robotic system is on. And these buttons run your pattern, run your stitch here. And then the next icon is your stitch button. So let's just say I was going to go to free motion and I was going to record, but I didn't want to stitch. I wanted to record with a paper pattern or pantograph underneath my foot. I want to record that pattern. I can actually not have it stitch. I can air, or what I call ghost mode record, with shutting off that needle. So keep in mind these next 5 icons, nothing happens with those until the robotics is on, but you could turn the machine off or turn the machine on with this. Your next icon is your stitches per inch, and it's, you know, if you were to measure it in the screen said 12 and it wasn't quite 12, keep in mind it varies with the thickness of thread, the density of your batting, things like that. So that's a estimation of how many stitches per inch you're going to get. Then your horizontal and vertical locks, again, these do not turn on until the robotic is on. So you have your left to right lock and you have your forward to backward lock. The next icon, the blue circle with the needle, is actually your icon with your stitch regulator. And when your machine is in robotics mode, you want your stitch regulator on when you're quilting. And then the last blue icon is your needle up down. I always like to start and stop with my needle up down. That way if I slightly shifted or something happened, then my needle's down and I don't have to worry about, my machine moving without that needle in the down position. And then your last icon, which is not highlighted either, that is your edit. So you can edit your patterns. And a great feature, you might want to play with that to see how to edit your patterns. Now we have lots of questions coming in, so let's go over and see what we have here. So the zoom will zoom in and out, and the farther in you go, the more pixelated, the more distorted the image might become. It's just giving you a specific zoom percent. It's not a fine-tune like a computer zoom, but you can zoom in and out with that. So Teddy says, let's say that you shut the machine off and you have saved a project. When you restart the machine, it asks for the home position to start the project again. And the home position is your house. So I'm still not sure if I'm answering your question, Teddy. And one of the things is that the home position, you should always be able to go back and forth with the home position. And we're going to talk about updates and, being sure that you've updated to the latest and greatest version that you can. And it may have something to do with that. I'm not sure on that, but we can look into it for you. So there are updates, and they're found on the Tin Lizzie website. And what you want to do with the updates is make sure that you're saving it to the USB stick and not in a file folder. It will not read it in the file folder. It has to be the file directly put onto the USB stick. And when it's put onto the USB stick and you walk through the process, and your manual will walk you through the process of doing the updates, then you can go through and get it to the latest and greatest version. And off the top of my head, I don't remember, we were discussing it yesterday at lunch, if it's 4.67 or 4.26, what the version is. I'm actually not in front of my Quilt Magician. I'm not in front of my frame. And so I'm not able to look at that for you, but you want to make sure that you're up to date on the latest and greatest version that there is. You can also calibrate your machine if when you are doing something and you touch, say, the home or one of your icons, and it's not exactly where you touched it that you're getting, you can calibrate the screen, and using your stylus will help with that so that you don't have to recalibrate your screen a lot. Keep in mind, when you move, when you touch things, static things like that, little shift screens, even on your sewing machine and things like that. That's why a lot of the machines come with a stylus so that you can have a better working relationship with that screen. So let's talk about setting the design. And, you know, this is a big question that comes in. How do I set the design? How do I set the design in a specific position? And this all is based on a few things. When is the foot important? And the foot is important a lot. We'll talk about that. What foot are you using? We're going to talk about that. Where is the foot positioned? Okay. And where is your needle positioned? So if you're setting up an edge-to-edge design and you know the size and everything, and you're setting up a block design, and then maybe you're setting up a border design, setting up any of those designs, the foot and the needle position become extremely important, because do you want the design to be 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the seam of where you're placing the design? Do you want the design to start right in the seam? Okay, so where your foot and where your needle is placed become very important. When is that foot important? Well, if you want to be 3/8 of an inch from the edge of your seam, then you might want the standard foot. If you're doing ruler work, the foot becomes important because of the distance from the needle to the ruler, and the height of that foot becomes important for you to maybe echo quilt, to stitch in the ditch. What foot are you using? I personally like an open toe foot so I can see where I'm going, but I can't use that when I'm doing ruler work. I can use that when I free motion. I can use that when I'm using the robotic so I can see better. Okay, and so the open toe foot is a low profile foot. That's the foot here. You can see it's a horseshoe. You can see in the opening, you have better visibility. The original foot is not quite as big around, this is the original, as the ruler foot. And the way that the arm comes off the foot is different. You have an open back on the ruler foot. Here it's tipped backwards. So all of those things make a difference when you're setting a design into a specific position. And we're going to show some pictures here of how to do a foot placement and how to set the design with your foot. So if I was setting this block in a block, I have to ask myself a couple questions. How close to the edge of my seams do I want the block to be? How far into the block do I want to be? Am I going to stitch in the ditch on this block? Okay, same thing with the border. Okay, when you do a border, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to set the border with a corner? Are we going to set the border a seam to seam, meaning have it start at a seam and end at the seam? What is that finishing technique we're going to do? So if we go back to this block here, and I use my highlighter, and let's just say that we're going to, spotlight, we're going to use a 4-point scaling or 2-point scaling, and for some reason my highlighter is not working this morning. Well, I apologize for that. We'll just use the arrow of the mouse. So here, this is where my needle position needs to be positioned to select the points. What I mean by that is when you set a block into a space, the needle position is how I'm going to determine how far from that seam we're going to be. If we go to the If we go to the border, if I'm setting the border that you see there, seam to seam, if I'm setting that border where it's going to start in a seam and end in a seam, I need to select my positioning points to set the border exactly in that seam. So when I line up my points, when I'm selecting that block, I'm going to set my points so that that seam is right where my needle is. And sometimes when we first start doing that, we can rock our fabric on the frame with our hands to make sure that it lands in that seam. But the more that we can position our placement when we're setting our block or border, whatever it is we're setting, that's going to help us. Now, Donna had asked about setting the design with an edge to edge, and we're going to show an edge to edge here in a moment. So I haven't forgot that question, Donna. And Pamela's asking, are you able to turn off the stitch regulator? And you are. If you go back to your menus where we were, and you go back to your machine has different features. You have an idle mode, you have a Lizzie mode, you have a manual mode. Manual mode is non-stitch regulated. Manual doesn't mean necessarily it's a free motion mode, although you can free motion in manual mode. Manual is non-stitch regulated. So yes, you can, Pam. And Rochelle would like to know, when you do free motion with record, how do you get it to stitch while you're doing that? Well, you need to have your machine stitching icon turned on. You can do it either way. You can free motion and ghost mode, as I was talking about, or you can free motion and stitch out. Either way, and you'll see it as you stitch on the screen. And we are going to do a webinar on record. So setting corner designs. You have a couple options with corner designs. You can float the corner designs, or you can join a corner design. So depending on setting the corner design, how you're going to do that, that's going to tell you how to set up your foot position and your needle position when you're laying out your quilt. So if I'm doing a floating corner, as you see at the top there, I want that design to be within the block. Maybe it's a cornerstone block. Maybe it's where my borders come together. And yours might be different, how your thought process, how you think about things. When you're joining a stitching to a border with your corner, that's going to be different. And each person here on the webinar could think differently with that also. Some people like to set the border in the center and then set their corners. Some people like to set their corners and then place the border between them. It's really what works best for you. I tend to put the border and then set my corners, unless I'm going to use a software program. And then if I'm using a software program, I'm going to connect the corners and the border together so that I have a nice transition. I can do that all at once. I take the quilt off the frame and turn my quilt to do my side borders, and it makes that easier. So again, you have a couple options depending on the person, depending on what you like to do. The way you find best is different maybe than your neighbors. So Donna, here's the answer to your question. Setting an edge-to-edge design. So a couple things we need to know about the edge-to-edge design is we need to know the layout of that design. And I specifically picked this design from the Quilt Magician because the size matters for this design specifically, not all, but specifically this design because of the nesting, because of the row distance. So the red dot shows you where the first row is. The red dot shows you where the second row starts, and the red dot Shows you where the third row starts. And it's not a border to border. So you couldn't set this design without editing it from border to border. This specific design needs to stitch off the fabric on all 4 sides. The beauty of an edge-to-edge design is it really hides flaws. It really hides our learning. It's a great design to learn with, but it hides things that we're trying to learn: how to position, how to lay out a quilt, how not to have the break between your edge-to-edge designs, how to nest, the distance to nest. So with an edge-to-edge design, it's a great learning design. So here's the edge-to-edge design. You can see it on the screen. And if this was the quilt or the table runner or the wall hanging, you can see on the left there's some odd space, some odd shape, okay? But on the quilt, if we were to start at the edge of the fabric, you're going to have to go in and freehand, okay? And so if you go into freehand, then you have to add all that space back in. So if I go here and put this red box and show you that all of the things outside of the red box area is off of the quilt, you're going to see that things will go much smoother. So how far you stitch off the edge will depend on the size of the design, the repeat of the design, and it also depends on the nesting, the next position, and this specific design is pretty wonky on the edges. Not all edge-to-edge designs are that wonky. So sometimes, because I have a software program, I print out a template so that I can see the design and know exactly what the design edges are. And Ramona asked what software program I use, and I use quite a few different software programs. I actually teach 7 different software programs, so there are quite a few different ones out there to use. Art and Stitch is probably the main software program that I use, Ramona. You could go in and, if you had software, and take off, say, this piece here and this piece here, this piece, but you still would have all of this wonky edge piece that when you stitch it, if you start at the edge of your quilt, it's not going to work very well. So where you start an edge-to-edge design really depends on that edge-to-edge design. So Pamela would like to know, on this edge-to-edge design, how can you be sure when you get to the end of the quilt that you will have the right size design if you only need 6 inches? Well, there's a couple things that you can do. You could calculate out the repeat of the design with your nesting to figure out exactly how many repeats would go down the quilt. So depending on if it was we'll just say a 10-inch design and I had a 50-inch quilt, and if there was no nesting, I know how many designs 10 goes into 50, how many times. For me, I'm not concerned with it being a whole design at the end, because again, if you notice, when it's cut off, you don't see that it's not a full design. An edge-to-edge design is made to go off the fabric. So what I tend to do is have table runners or placemats at the end of my quilt. So if my edge-to-edge design is big enough to fill in those, then I use those at the end of my quilt. So I tend not to worry about making sure that it's the exact amount to fit into the space. That has to do with just calculating it out and the math. So here's a border to border. So if you're setting in a border to border, imagine the blue line being the edge of the quilt, and it has borders on all four sides. The red dot is my sewing machine foot placement. So that's where I'm going to place the sewing machine and needle when I position this design to set it. So with the Quilt Magician, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up, then I'm going to select my points, my area, my space, with the needle positioned right in the seam. And sometimes I even put my needle in the up-down position going down to ensure that it's in that seam when I set it. So setting a border-to-border quilt with a design like this, I want those seams to go in the border so I can vary them. Now you may have a border-to-border where it's floating from border to border, and then you wouldn't need to be concerned with exactly where that foot position is in that seam. You might just say, well, I'm going to set my foot inside. So instead of being right on the corner, maybe the foot is inside of all of your seams. And that way you don't have to worry about setting all of these seams within. There's also setting a triangle design. So ask yourself a couple questions when you're setting a triangle design. Okay? Is a triangle going to go into a square? Okay? Or is the triangle going to go into a triangle? Because that's going to vary on how you set your design. So it's something you have to think about, because a triangle, if we look here, is a half of a square. So I could put a triangle design in half of this and freehand in the other half. Or I could put the triangle design in a triangle. And that takes a little bit of practice with the triangle to understand how to set that with the Quilt Magician. But it's really quite beautiful, and you come out with things like this, because triangles do have many options. 4 triangles equal a square, 2 triangles equal a square. So depending on what you're doing, there are lots of options. So let's talk about the file manager. And the file manager is, if you have software or if you have downloaded designs, you need to be able to put those into your Quilt Magician. So this is the file manager screen, what it looks like. And in here we have some sources. We have the internal source, which is the source inside of the Quilt Magician. Could be your SD card, could be things that you've recorded. Then we have the USB stick, and the USB stick can be removed and designs can be downloaded from the internet to the USB stick. You have previews and you have layouts. We're going to talk about the USB stick. So let's just say that you've downloaded a design from a website and you've downloaded it in one of the file formats, the correct file formats. And now you need to save it to your USB stick. So we insert the USB stick into the computer. And when we insert the USB stick into the computer, we can drag and drop single files to the USB stick. Once we drag and drop those files to the USB stick, we want to be sure to do a safe eject, and I'll walk you through how to do that on your computer here in just a moment. And then we can save that file to the Quilt Magician. So you'll notice that it goes from USB stick. Here's the file name. This is a file that's in the Quilt Magician. And we would like to copy it to The question is, are we going from USB to the computer, to the Quilt Magician? Are we going from the Quilt Magician to a USB? These are the things you have to click. So you'll notice this black dot is highlighted for USB. Okay. This black dot is highlighted to put the destination into the Quilt Magician. You can copy and delete also from the file manager. So if you want to save it, the internal, and take it into software and utilize it, you can do that. Or something that you have recorded, you can do that. So using a USB stick, any external device like a SD card, a USB stick, you use it with the file manager. You can import and export designs. Again, the system reads the QCC, the QLI, and the DXF files. And if you need help with this, your manual has great instructions, even has instructions in the troubleshooting section of the manual for you to be able to understand how the USB stick works and how the file manager works. Be sure to set it for the USB stick. So when I showed you here, if your source is the USB stick, you want to be sure to set the source as the USB stick. Highlight that block, highlight that little black dot, and then you can save or copy the design internally or take a design from the Quilt Magician to the USB stick. And then you may use the same method to delete as you do copy, as you do to save a design. So there's a lot with the file manager, and I'm just, touching it just a little bit, but the file manager, you want to go in and look at it and save a design to your USB stick and, play with that because you want to know how that works. Pamela would like to know, can you read and use designs from the USB stick without having it saved to the Quilt Magician? You can read designs if you have a software program. So there are many software programs out there. DXF file, this file can be read in different non-quilting file programs. And I don't know all the programs that can be read in, but off the top of my head, I believe CorelDRAW and Adobe Illustrator. So different programs you can read or view these files in. In order to do that, you would need a software program to read. The QCC is a quilting file format. The QLI is a quilting file format. And the DXF is quilting or an art file or line file program. So safely removing the USB stick or your SD card, and this is from PC World, and it's really important that we remove those correctly. And here's what happens if we do not. If we have a USB stick in our computer and we've saved some designs to it and we pull out the USB stick when the computer is still reading the USB stick, you might corrupt that file. And that file then cannot be used. It will need to be deleted and re-put on your USB stick because it has segments, it has parts to it. And whatever the computer was reading when we pulled the USB stick or SD card out of our computer, it has made an error in that unit. So to do a safe eject, what you want to do is you want to go down to the bottom right-hand corner of your computer, and computers are all different. So I'm giving you a generic version of how to do this. There are many ways to do a safe eject, but this is one way. If you go down to the corner, I had clicked on this white arrow here, and this little box came up. Where the blue arrow is pointing for my computer, That's telling me I have something in my computer, a USB stick, a hub, something is in my computer that it sees. When that registers, then what happens is I can right mouse click on that and it will let me know if I can safely remove the hardware and eject it. If it says that it's busy and I remove that, that's when I might get the corrupt file. So pretty important that I do that safe eject in order not to corrupt any of the files, have any issues with things that are happening to that device. And so here you can see on my computer, when I took this image, I had a USB flash disk, which is a USB stick. I had my passport, which is my backup hard drive. And so for those devices, if I wanted to eject those, I would need to make sure that I had that safe removal of those devices. So a couple of you are saying that you've had issues with corrupt files. So you'll find that you'll have less issues. I'm not saying you still won't have some of those corrupt files, but you'll have less issues with corrupt files if you use the safe eject. It's just a good practice, a best practice to do. So updating the system. It updates the program, it updates the robotics. And really important to verify what system you're at, what update you're at, and if you need to update it, then we'll want to go ahead and make sure that you do that. Because there are lots of different things that happen with updates. Debugging. When you get a Windows update or a Mac update or a phone update, a lot of times it gives you new features, but it also gives you a debugging. So you want to make sure you do that. So update the system, update your program, update your robot. All of those things are extremely important. Now, system information, that's where you can go in and look at the information for your setup, for your Quilt Magician. Motor forward, earlier we saw where it talked about the motor forward, and we talked about the calibration of the screen. Here's where you get to those. Under parameters, so under the parameters, it's really important for you not to really play with these too much because they're set here for specific reasons. Your length is set to work with your stitch regulator. So depending on the machine that the robotics is on, that length is set with the stitch regulator so they work together. The max speed is the speed of your settings of your pattern. So when you're running a pattern, you have a max speed that you're set at. Can you override that? Yes. You're in control then. So the computer will pick the best ideal speed, but you can override that. Depending on what you're doing, you might find you want to do that. The minimum speed is the lowest speed that you want to run, and Tin Lizzie recommends with the Quilt Magician that you run no lower than 1 or 2. That's the lowest you really want to run. The lock, this is the number of locking stitches. So, you know, Pam might want 2 locking stitches, Ramona might want 3 locking stitches. I may not want any locking stitches at all because I'm going to lock them myself and vary them. So those can be changed. This is a great way to have some customization to your Quilt Magician for what you like. And then the needle, setting the needle speed. The needle will run up and down and have a specific speed that it runs. The default is set at 5. You can adjust that to where you want that. Your constants, and if you haven't noticed, we're just going across the tabs in this window. So we did the updates and parameter. Now we're on the constants. You have an X and Y motor. You have a left to right motor. That's the X. You have a forward to backward motor. That's the Y. All of these are set according to your machine, your frame, your stitch regulator. You really don't want to change those. The default for the X and Y, if you had changed those, is 30. So I'm going to pause here and answer some questions because there's lots of questions coming in. I want you to know that there will be more classes added to the Tin Lizzie website. All the classes are being recorded and posted on the Tin Lizzie website, and we're going to do lots more to help you learn your system. So let me go to the questions that we have here. So Don, I think we answered your question about the edge to edge. Ramona says that she loves her Quilt Magician and she uses software in conjunction to create all kinds of fun things to stitch. And you know what, Ramona, I do also. You and I love software. And I can't live without software. I take digital pictures of things. So I was in the hotel here this morning. I was actually taking pictures of the carpeting to make designs from it. And on my blog last week, I posted a picture of a lady's shirt she had on, and I took a picture of it and made a design out of that. So what you can do is really endless when you have a software component. And it's not necessary, but it does just make things endless of what the possibilities are. So Pamela is asking about changing the size of the pattern when you turn the quilt and try to join the corners with the rest of the quilting border. So what I do is I stitch my top border and corner out if it has a corner. I stitch the center section of my quilt, and then I stitch the lower border and corner. And then I take my quilt off the frame and I trim up the edge. I don't square it up. I trim it up so that I have a nice, maybe 2 or 3 inches from the edge of my quilt, so that when I put it back on the frame, I know that it's going on the frame straight. And I put it back on the frame, and then I stitch that final border. Sometimes that border is longer than what the top border is, and I think that what you're asking about is, how do I fit that border into the new space? And that will take some calculation to figure out, okay, if the top border was this size and my side border is this size, how many repeats do I need within that space? You can let the Quilt Magician help you with that. You can do math to calculate it out. It's really figuring out which way works best for you. Most of the time I let the Quilt Magician help me with that, and I, lay out my quilt, let it know what the size space is that I'm putting the design in, and figure out how many will fit within that space. Pamela is asking, can you read and use designs from the USB stick without having them saved to the Quilt Magician? The process is actually taking it from the USB stick to the Quilt Magician. So that screen that I took you to, and let's go back to that screen a second here. The screen here. This is actually how you bring designs in and view them with your Quilt Magician. So you'll bring it in from the USB stick and you can save it into the Quilt Magician. So the question is, about me saying that I use the open toe foot. And I use the open toe foot because I have a better view, because I have a better vision. I can see exactly where I'm going. I like better visibility, and I can get that with the open toe foot. The original foot that came with my Tin Lizzie, it's a small opening, and it is a high side. So it makes it hard to see. It makes it hard for me to position that needle exactly where I need it to be when I'm positioning the design with the Quilt Magician. So when I put an open toe foot on, and you can get that from Tin Lizzie or from one of the stores, when I put an open toe foot on, I can now visually see, here's where my thread broke, or here's where I need to set my design, or, you know, all of that. But I can't see very well with the other 2 feet. Even though the ruler foot is bigger, I still can't see exactly where that needle lies. And I actually have a laser that I put on my machine that points directly to where the needle is going to fall in the fabric, so I get precisely where I want to be. I surely would like to know how I got to this screen. This screen is actually under the house, under your home, and it's the file manager screen. When setting a triangle, Angela's asking, when setting a triangle, how do you do the area? Well, an area and a triangle, that's where we were talking about. A triangle could be set into a square, and you could do that with 2 individual points. Most of the time, I'm going to set it with 4 points, multiple points, not just 2, because if something's skewed, if something's not exactly where it needs to be, then that way I can set it where it needs to be. If I'm setting a square in a triangle, that's going to be a triangle in a triangle, excuse me, that's going to be a little different. So maybe what I'll do is I'll put on the schedule to do a class specifically on setting triangles, or we can do a little video to show that, Angela, because setting a triangle, when I first started doing this, I got myself into trouble because, you know, I wasn't thinking, well, a triangle and a square, it's still going to be a triangle. It's just only taking up half that square. And so maybe that would be a better way to do that, because we're visual people and we need to see sometimes how these things work. Alice said when she used the open toe foot with a panto and high loft batting, it sometimes caught and hung up. And it can do that on a high loft batting. I'm not one that uses a lot of high loft batting. If I am using a high loft batting, I'll use my original foot or my ruler foot, because that open toe foot is a very flat foot, and you don't want it to get caught on your quilt. You can raise that foot up a little bit, and I do that by putting a dime under the foot, lowering the foot on the biggest seam of my quilt, and then positioning that foot in that position so that it doesn't get caught on my fabric. Jane would like to know, how can you adjust the amount of stitches that the quilt motion will add to connect repeat designs? That has to do with your tie off. So if they're not connected together and there's a small break, it's going to think that you have 2 individual designs. So a couple things. You might want to make sure that they're literally connected together, or you can shut that tie-off and have 0 tie-offs for that, Jane. And there's a few different ways to do that. You might want to just test it on something and see what happens. And then if you test it on that and it works, then you know you have exactly what you want. But definitely I would test it on something small, just 2 small little pieces that you might want to do instead of on a big quilt the first time. You know, I always do small tests before I take it right to the quilt and do things with the big quilt. Lots of questions coming in. So I'm reading through. I'm still here just seeing what questions we have. Yeah, so the ruler foot is higher on the sides. It's open in the back. It's actually open all the way around. So if you were going to do ruler work, your ruler would fit right up around the foot all the way around without hitting the shank of the foot. And so the ruler foot is a great foot that has been added to the family of Tin Lizzie feet. I'll have to do that. Shirley would like to see the laser for my needle, and I can do that. I can show you exactly what I have. Maybe I'll put a write-up on my blog about the laser for my needle, because it does make a difference. You know, when we want to be extremely precise, we can be, and there are tools to help us with that. And sometimes without those tools, it doesn't make it quite as easy as it would if we had those tools. Will would like to know what the layout button is. And the layout, you have a layout option, and that's for you to save your entire quilt area. So you could actually lay out the quilt area and save it and remember it. Does the open toe foot change thread tensions at all? I have not found that it does, so I'm not sure really if it does or it doesn't, but with what I've done, I have not found that the thread tension changes with that foot. What I have found is that I have to watch when I pull my bobbin thread up where my bobbin thread is when the foot moves, because I don't want to get it caught on that foot. So what I tend to do is pull it towards the back or out of the way, and as soon as the machine is a couple inches away from the beginning of the stitching, then I knot my thread and I bury it. Well, lots and lots of questions. I'm excited that all of you are enjoying the webinars and, you know, are attending these, because we want to do some more, and we like to know that you like the webinars and learning. So thank you for attending. And as always, I want everybody to have a happy quilting experience.